Welcome to the Culture Design Show, where we feature conversations with leaders and thinkers who are passionate about culture and design. Now, let's get started with the show.
Steve Chaparro here. I am the host of the Culture Design Show, a podcast where I feature leaders and thinkers at some of the top creative firms in the world, including architecture, design, technology, and marketing. What's the one thing they have in common? They all believe in the power of culture and design. This podcast is brought to you by Culture Design Studio. We help people and culture leaders who feel constrained in their ability to engage their employees to become champions for their people. Through a series of facilitated workshops, we provide a practical and collaborative process to transform the culture within your creative organization. We've worked with organizations like Duarte Design, Design Thinkers Group, Red Bull, USAID, Bacardi, and the Office of Civic Innovation. If you're looking for more than just a consultant, but someone who can facilitate your organization through a structured conversation to transform your culture, reach out to us. To learn more, go to culturedesignstudio.com. Douglas Ferguson is an entrepreneur and human-centered technologist with over 20 years of experience. He is the president of Voltage Control, an Austin-based workshop agency that specializes in design sprints and innovation workshops. He's also a partner at Capital Factory, which is the center of gravity for entrepreneurs in Texas. I bet you didn't know that Texas is the #1 startup state in the U.S. Douglas is also the author of Beyond the Prototype, a new book that outlines a practical 6-step plan for companies struggling with the shift from discovery to launch. Douglas, welcome to the Culture Design Show.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Well, I'm glad to be here. We're actually here in Austin, in your office, and I am so excited that I can make the trip out to visit you in the wild, in your home city and state. So thank you for being on the show.
Of course.
Well, what I love to do is I love to just kind of dig into your past and your story. I love to hear, where are you from and what was it like for you growing up?
Oh, wow. Grew up in Southern Virginia. Both of my parents grew up on tobacco farms, and I was the first generation in the family to go to college. And, my parents were the first ones to not be tobacco farmers. They both went into city jobs, as they say. And my mom was a bookkeeper for a jewelry store, and my dad started shoveling coal at the local power plant and worked his way up to foreman, and eventually started to take correspondence course where he basically got an engineering degree through the mail.
Wow.
I remember as a kid, being really interested in his trigonometry books and stuff. And it was just really fascinating because I was always really into math and whatnot. And so my dad was studying advanced mathematics, through the mail. And he became a turbine specialist and was engineering really large projects at the power plant, which is really fascinating because watching this kind of almost like American dream, as we often refer to it, kind of unfold before my eyes. And also, he was always really interested in computers and technology in general. And so we had a Commodore 64 when I was a young kid. And I remember writing software for him in high school that helped him with some of his power plant outages. So that's when I first started to get a real love for writing software and building systems and kind of procedural thinking. And went to school at Virginia Tech, where I studied math, biology, and chemistry, which has nothing to do with computers. I found I had such a love for it. I was kind of scared of actually, doing it for work because I thought it might take something away from it. Yeah. Same thing. I didn't want to study music. Been a musician most of my life and toured around bands and stuff. And also for that same reason, I didn't want to turn it into something that someone told me how I was supposed to do it, or there was this right or wrong way, because I just enjoyed it so much. And needless to say, I enjoyed it so much that I started doing it for a career. Like after college, just started working for some startups here and there, and writing testing software, and that's what led me to Austin, because there was a great startup scene here. Then I started to get promoted and manage teams, and it's kind of at the very end there, before starting Voltage Control, launched a few of my own startups, mostly holding CTO roles, and as a CTO, I was very product focused. There's a real kind of deep fascination with process and how to organize teams and motivate them, get them excited, build buy-in. And so when I discovered the design sprint through Jake's early blog posts and whatnot, and then further cemented by the fact that Google Ventures led our Series A, and Jake got to come down and do a design sprint with us, then just really fell in love with the process, because it really baked into 1 week a lot of the things that I'd seen over the years, and experimented with myself, but had done so in such an elegant way, and also helped people get past this kind of knowing doing gap. Like, so many people knew that they should be testing with customers and doing these things, but it really kind of forced the hand. And then once they realized how easy it is, and like, oh, I can do this, it starts to build some capability. And that's what I mentioned in the book about the sprint mindset, because often people talk a lot about, we got to get the problem framing right before a design sprint. And I agree, it's important, but sometimes, that I don't worry so much about the problem if I know that they're going to walk away with a new mindset. If it's going to shift the culture of that organization, I don't care if they don't walk away with a straight, like, a revenue outcome of that particular workshop, because the revenue is going to come if you shift the culture.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've often said that while there might be a primary outcome to that design sprint or a workshop or whatever, I've always believed that the secondary outcome is the culture change. But you're flipping it. You're saying that the culture change is, in fact, even more important than the desired product outcome, or at least as equal.
Yes, it can be more important. The thing is you just have to set clear expectations. If you have a stakeholder or a sponsor that has different expectations, then it may not work out well for you if you're pushing hard on the cultural stuff. But if you have those conversations up front and they understand it, and they see the need and the benefit for this shift, then that can be a great thing to focus on. And generally there's some problem we're working through the sprint, but we're not going to belabor it so much that we wait around for the perfect opportunity, because we know that even if whatever we solve for is incremental, that the cultural shift is going to be massive, because then they can continue to iterate and continue to evolve, so that in things that they discover in the following weeks could be even more impactful than whatever comes up during that week, because we built a muscle.
Right. So for those people that are listening that may not know who Jake is and who Google Ventures is, and may not even know much about the design sprint, if you can, give us a little bit of history behind that.
Sure. Yeah. I follow a methodology around the design sprint that comes from a book by Jake Knapp and Braden Kowitz and John Zeratsky. These guys were all at Google Ventures, which is a venture capital company, firm that was owned by Google, and their portfolio companies included Slack and Blue Bottle Coffee, lots of companies that we've heard of. And Jake Knapp had worked at Google, and he was working on Gmail at the time. And if you've heard about the 20% time, Jake had a 20% project at Google, which was focused on kind of how we meet and how we digitally meet. And now we know that product as Hangouts. And he was working with a team that was distributed, and quite a bit of them were in Europe. And he noticed that it was just really hard to get traction on the project. They kind of moved in little fits and spurts, and it was hard to get and build and maintain momentum. And so they were planning a meeting where they were going to get together and work on it like they had in the past. And he thought to himself, well, what if I tried to design the best meeting or the best week? So we spend our time together as optimally as possible. And he did. And he came back and he thought to himself, wow, we got so much more done. There are things I would change, but this seems to have some legs to it. And so after working on it more, thinking about it more, he managed to craft a role for himself at Google where he was actually going around from team to team. Like if you had a project you wanted to start, you could actually have Jake come kickstart your project. And then Google Ventures caught wind of it, and they thought, wow, it'd be really great for you to do that for portfolio companies. And so he did, and that's how he and the others amassed so many great stories that we find in the book. And so they really road tested that thing and beat it and tried it 6 ways to the sunset. And then that's the checklist we now have in the book. And then there are companies like Voltage Control and AJ and Smart and others that have tweaked the process and added little hacks and little riffs on things. And so there's kind of a discipline, a domain of kind of expertise and practices that have evolved out of what happened in the book. And it's kind of a cottage industry, if you will, around this work. And I personally am really fascinated by the fact that it's so powerful in so many different contexts. So if you look at the work in the book and the types of companies that Google Ventures invests in, they're a very kind of specific type of company, right? Software company at a very specific stage in the journey of the company. And the fact that it's been able to kind of cross or transcend these different types of companies, these different industries, even different departments within the company is pretty powerful and I think fascinating to me. And when people ask me, well, how do you do design sprints for sales, or how do you do design sprints for HR? My answer is always, it's about the prototyping. And you have to apply the prototyping mindset, because you're not necessarily going to use Mural or Figma or Envision. You might have to use other tools. You had to get resourceful and creative, but ultimately thinking about what questions are we trying to answer, and who can answer them, and what kind of interface do we have to create so we can get those answers that we seek.
So what are some of the steps within the design sprint? So, we know that the Google Venture model was 5 days. AJ and Smart has adapted it to what they call 2.0, which is 4 days. And you probably have somewhat of a similar version yourself, but what are some of the overall agenda for that particular week?
Sure, yeah. I mean, oddly enough, we still stick to the 5 day. We find it, especially if you're trying to have change within an organization, cultural change, that it's good to take your time and really kind of seep yourself into the experience and the methods. 4 day can really work if an agency's coming in and helping you get to some product design, and you're really expecting them to deliver the results. But if you're going to do the work internally, I think the 5 day is still ideal. You can get away with 4 days, but really you're moving quickly. It's just less time for innovation to seep in, I think. Now, the original format, 5 days, the first day we're going to map out our problem space. And so we're going to look at getting really aligned on a goal, where we're headed. We're going to bring in some external experts. They might be internal to the company, but external to the sprint team, and get really curious about them, listen to what they have to say. Through our own conversations within the sprint team, things we're learning from the experts, we'll start to map out the problem space so that we can kind of visually understand what we're dealing with and what the kind of milestones are in this kind of journey that the user or any actor that's interfacing with our product or our service is going through. And at the end of the day, we're going to pick a target on that map that we're going to spend our time the rest of the week focusing on. On Tuesday, we will start off getting inspired by some analogous inspiration, some lightning demos, and then we'll take that inspiration as well as all the work we've done on Monday to start individually sketching out solutions. On Wednesday, we'll decide on which solution we're going to prototype, and we'll end the day making a storyboard to lock in all our decisions so that on Thursday we can go really heads down on building that prototype. There's no more questions or decisions to make because we really locked it in, and then we build it all in one day, and then on Friday we test it with 5 users. So it's really about getting that prototype built, testing it so we can get to answers and ultimately insights.
Yeah, so I have a background in architecture, and there's a workshop format that we have used in our industry, and it's called a design charrette. And it's basically you're going to heads down for 3, 4, 5 days, and you're going to get basically a prototype, which is really schematic design in the world of architecture, and get feedback from your client. But what I've been fascinated about is, again, as you've said, how this can be used for so many different things. It's not just product design. It's not just service design, business model design, but you can actually prototype branding, marketing, messaging. You can even prototype an internal policy. What's been interesting, though, has been a little bit of pushback from, like, say, one particular space that I work in is civic innovation. And so you're working with city governments, and one in particular, the Office of Civic Innovation for the City of Long Beach, is the in-house innovation consultancy. So the idea of being able to spend 4 or 5 full days in 1 week for basically a self-described bureaucrat has been really hard. And so we've had to kind of pull different modules from that process. Although what I really love about the design sprint format is that you're not just going to ideation. And when people love going to ideation and then just stopping there, they don't take it to what the design sprint does. And it's actually prototyping and then fully testing those things, which I think is a powerful sort of distinguisher within the design sprint.
Yeah, I agree. And, even then, people still can get stuck. I talk about the design sprint slump in my book. And momentum is important to really maintain, because if you have the luxury of getting, because it's difficult, to bring together a group and get them passionate and aligned on a vision and then start to make progress. And if you have that, then it's worth the effort to make sure to maintain it. And I agree. People can get together and throw ideas around, but the layering in the constraints and the feasibility in these things can start to stop people in their tracks. And to your other point around using bits and pieces of it, I absolutely love to think about and encourage people to take the mindset and borrow the philosophy and put that in their everyday meetings. In fact, we just launched our 10 meeting mantras this week, and a lot of them were inspired by things we learned in design sprints. And these are things that you can do in everyday meetings to change the way you work together. And I think design sprints are heavy artillery. Like, you don't just do a 5-day design sprint every week. It would not make sense. You wouldn't get other things done.
And physically, it's impossible to do that every week. It just, yeah. It
would grind you down. And so it really does have, that's why that problem framing stuff's so important. I would say if you don't have a big enough problem, then, that's the number one reason why people start to get antsy about it being 5 days. So I usually really dig into that. Like, what is it that's causing you the heartburn around this 5-day commitment? Is the problem not big enough? Do you not have funding? Can you literally not afford it? In a lot of cases, when people think they can't afford it, it's actually they can't afford not to, because otherwise you're just going out of business slower.
Yeah. Well, so I know you've worked with a lot of different companies, probably different industries as well. And I would imagine that there are some things that are probably required from a mindset perspective of leadership, that if they're going to bring this process either 1 into their team or 2 into their company, what are some areas of pushback that you've seen from leadership?
The time commitment's a big one. We were just talking about that. The interesting thing is I've seen a pretty big shift as far as the acknowledgement that design matters and co-creation is a powerful thing. Open innovation has gotten much more popular than closed innovation. You know, there's there's less and less of this mindset of, well, we got to keep our thing a secret, and more about, well, let's share it and find out what we can learn. And so that's I still see that to some degree where they feel that this is a real differentiator in the market, and so co-creation or sharing the idea is difficult because they want to make sure they keep that close to the chest. There are ways to work around it with like testers being under NDA and whatnot, but it's definitely an issue. Also, this work and these concepts are completely predicated on this notion that you iterate quickly with small batches and test often and learn as much as you can. And if people are in a waterfall mindset, or they're letting the regulations kind of rule them, if you will, then that can also get in the way and prevent really seeing the benefits of what this stuff can offer. And the thing I recommend there is like, there's always leeway. And also there's a difference between the regulation and how we've reacted to the regulation historically. So really having real conversations with folks and finding out what's actually possible, given the new, the way things are today, and do we have to keep behaving the way we've always behave, or responding the same way we've always responded to those regulations, and are there new ways to interpret them, or new things that we can do to protect ourselves, so that while we also still make use of this new kind of thinking.
So there's been a lot of talk, and I'm not sure if I'm sure you are, but familiar with the term VUCA, this VUCA world. And, we are in this ever-changing world. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And the best practices that we've employed over, say, the last 20, 30 years have served us well to get us here. But as Marshall Goldsmith says, what got us here won't get us there. And so because things are changing so fast, I've noticed two things. One, the executives, the C-suite is no longer the smartest layer of people in the company.
I don't know if they ever were.
Well, that may be the case as well. And two, consultants, the subject matter experts, are not necessarily the subject matter experts of a particular culture within an organization, and even a subject matter of just certain things out in the world. Because I believe sometimes I've seen where consultants will come in, they will do all the work, all the research, determine the insights and strategies, and even ideate and come up with the recommendations, and they leave this really thick recommendation, literally, put it, the louder the thump, the better for a consultant in terms of that strategic recommendation. But then many times, because the companies themselves were not part of that process, I call it the birthing process of that strategy, they don't understand why certain recommendations were made. So they don't know how to translate. And sometimes in conversation with a consultant, they might say, man, this sounded really good when we were having the conversation, but when I actually have to go and implement it, like, I don't remember anything we said. And so therefore, a very small percentage of the recommendations get implemented. And then sometimes those strategies were based on circumstances that happened 12, 18, 24 months ago, and things have changed since then. So what I've come to understand, and I love your thoughts on it, is there's no better subject matter expert of a organization's culture than the employees. Absolutely. And so what can we do to invite those employees into this process? How have you seen that being done at organizations that you've worked with?
I see it being done a lot at organizations we work with, because that is completely how we work.
That's great.
Yeah. We have this, we like to refer to ourselves as, we don't bring the answers, we extract the answers.
There you go. I love that. And I've used that word too. So, dude, fist bump.
Fist bump, boom. Yeah, you know, that's why I don't love being called a consultant, you know?
I agree with you.
And I also believe strongly that people have to create things if they want to have a deep sense of ownership. I don't believe in buy-in, because this whole notion of building buy-in is, I think, flawed. It's like this idea that I'm going to come up with this amazing thing and then convince everyone that it's great. So making sure that everyone has contributed to the shaping of the solution means that they're going to have a deep sense of ownership and connectedness to the solution, and then they're going to support it. Yeah, I mean, I could go into a lot of stuff there. I want to come back to the VUCA stuff because I'm a huge fan of complexity, and I love this concept. There's this quote that's like, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, and you don't bring a cookie cutter solution to a complex problem. Absolutely. And so what happens when an expert comes in is they're going to provide a cookie cutter solution because that's what they do. They're going to lean in on their knowledge, and it's the curse of knowledge, right? They can't know what it's like to not know the things they know, and that's going to influence everything that they bring as far as suggestions of how to operate. Now, I would argue that if you do need consultants because they're going to provide context on some very complicated piece of equipment or machinery or process or protocol, then have them at the table. But they should not be the ones facilitating and designing the answer. They should be at the table so that they're part of the diverse equation that the diversity of thought that's in the room. We like to talk about room intelligence, so you want them part of the room intelligence, but ideally there's a facilitator who's unbiased and very skilled at like making sure that everyone has a voice and is comfortable and that we can make quick decisions and move forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah, there's and so part of this conversation, I'm going to say more things about things that I've been wrestling with, and you as a user or tester of principles, I'd love to hear what you have to think about it. So I come from the world of architecture, and I would say part of this best practices, whether it's the last 30, 40 years or more, that a lot of the design of organizations is this top-down command and control, hierarchical type of structure. They know best. They've determined strategies and just communicate downstream so that people just fall in line. I've come to think that as generations start to get older, even the millennial generation and the Generation Z, that these younger generations are no longer going to tolerate what maybe my generation, the Generation X generation, kind of tolerated in the past, and they're going to want to have want to participate in the design. So I believe, and again, using architecture language, I believe that leaders have to move from being architects of culture to becoming facilitators of culture. How does that, or does that not resonate with you?
Completely resonates. We've been talking a lot about how facilitation is the future of work. It's not just about how we have to lead. It's also going to be super important as more and more things become automated, as machine learning and AI begin to take over certain things that are frankly mundane, and it's great that we won't have to do them. We're really going to have to lean on our human faculties more and more. And what is the one role and the one methodology that is the most effective at helping us tap into what's most powerful about humans? That's facilitation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this week, tomorrow, is going to start 3 days of 2 master classes and 1 conference. It's Control the Room, and it's all about the art and science of facilitation. I mean, I had a creative director at a very large design agency say, hey, we realize that a lot of our clients now are want us to be more than just creatives where we do the work for them. They actually want to co-create with us. Yes. So we need to become this triple threat of creative, a co-creative / facilitator, and a coach. But we don't know how to be good facilitators. Can you teach us? And I'm starting to sense, I mean, we believe it. We've been drinking the Kool-Aid, but now I think people are starting to realize that the skill of facilitation is becoming more and more important. What have you heard? I mean, obviously you believe this, but what have you heard in the marketplace about that skill?
Well, it's less about, I don't know if I've necessarily heard things. It's just about what I'm observing. So I'm seeing more companies build facilitation practices or have facilitation training as part of an internal capability building. And one thing that's really fascinating when you look at companies like Home Depot and Cisco and whatnot that are building these facilitation practices inside their company is that once they start, those teams become swamped because the other departments and groups that are starting to learn about them and start to use them start to see the benefits and want more and more and more. So that is telling in itself. The fact that these teams are just, when they start to form and start to do the work, that they just get they're just getting hammered with requests. That's pointing out a need, a very deep pain and need that's unfulfilled.
So let's go into your book now. So your book is called Beyond the Prototype. What led you to write this book?
After doing countless design sprints for companies, I started to notice a trend. And then after I thought about the trend more, I realized that, I've seen this before, not just out of design sprints. And even though I tell the story from the perspective of design sprints, it is really applicable to any time that you're getting together to ideate or think about solutions. Before we started the chat, you were telling me about how people can get really excited about ideas and then it can go nowhere. And hackathons are maybe the worst example. It's like, I don't even know. I mean, it's like, okay, sure, it might be a fun way to meet people over the weekend, but what really comes out of it, right? Yeah. Or some great way to market your new API, just get people to hack on it and use it. And I think real innovation and real work requires perseverance and persistence. And, you have to drill. Sometimes people get lucky, but I mean, it's very, very rare. Most of the time you come out of a design sprint with more questions than you started with. And so, and there was just no rule book or handbook of how to do that. And so I thought, well, why don't I make a swing at this? And ultimately I was less interested in coming up with the right answers and more interested in starting a conversation and trying to put myself at the epicenter of that conversation or as close to it as I could so that I could start to understand even some of the struggles that I wasn't seeing and start to have a dialogue about, well, how did other people fix this and how might I have approached it and whatnot. And so so far it's been a really amazing journey. We've done, half a dozen or more workshops for Beyond the Prototype where we've looked at what, where people are getting stuck and what they're doing about it. And so that's been really fascinating and actually starting to work on version 2 of the book. It just got a publishing deal out of the Netherlands and really excited to incorporate some of those learnings. But I think a lot of it still holds true. It's just I've got some new stuff to share and some tweaks to make it maybe a little more digestible for some folks. And coming back to that point around everyone is finding themselves in the slump post design sprint, and I just developed these 6 steps or things to think about post design sprint.
Yeah, I love the graphic that you have in the book. So it's you show like a spectrum. So on one end it's the ideas, and many times that's where it stops. But then on the other extreme is the outcomes. And so that's 6 steps basically is the bridge between those two. And you say that the first one is wrap it up. What do you mean by wrap it up as the first step?
A pitfall a lot of people fall into is assuming the design sprint is the thing. And a lot of that expectation comes from the rhetoric around, oh, you'll get 6 months of results in 1 week. And while that can be true, we have to also make sure that people understand that there's still a lot of work to do after the design sprint. You're not going to have code-ready designs. There's going to be more discovery and work to do to understand what it is that you need to build and how to meet the user where they're at. And that's what Wrap It Up is all about. It's about looking at what were our sprint questions and which ones were answered and which ones were not answered. How do we go about revising the prototype and getting to more clarity and specific insights and answers on those questions? Also, when we ran the interviews, did we surface any other questions? Is there anything else that we're kind of unclear on or we need to drill down more on? Then we will go there as well. And often some people will call that an iteration sprint. And sometimes you got to do 3, 4, 5 iteration sprints. In the case of Twyla, we iterated quite a bit on this one feature that showed a lot of promise, but the user didn't trust it. They were like, "Oh, that's interesting, but I don't know. What are they up to? What are these guys doing? They're trying to trick me." Mm-hmm. It's like, sounds too good to be true. All these kinds of things, right? And so basically, we just kept iterating on the treatment and the tweaking the pricing a little bit, tweaking the language until finally we just got consistent, oh yeah, that looks great. I'd totally do that. And so, yeah. So the wrap it up piece is before we even, we know we want to move forward on this thing. The momentum's great. We need to lean in on it. But if we don't get to specificity around what this thing is and what the build is, then we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot because we're going to go back to old practices and probably do it wrong.
Yeah, I think that's so important, whether it's, people call it a debrief or even group reflection. And even in a 1 or 2 day workshop, I've seen how valuable it is to have just that time to, when we talk about tension and release, it's that release or reflection period where you can just kind of, wrap up what was done, but consider all the lessons that were learned throughout that particular engagement.
Absolutely. We just launched our meeting mantras, and one of them is debrief for durability. And I think it's important to debrief on every meeting. And if you're doing a workshop, you should totally debrief on every activity. Sometimes that doesn't make sense because activities kind of build upon each other, but there definitely should be punctuations throughout the day that you're allowing debrief for 2 reasons. One, you want to make sure that the lesson landed, especially if they're actually there's some learnings or there's some synthesis that's happening. Then if you don't debrief, it's not going to stick because that's how people learn. It's like having the reflection moment. And then also to make sure we're all aligned, which leads into the next step, which is sharing the story. Right. Because we were in the same meeting, it should sound like it. Yeah. And if you disband your design sprint team and they all go back because this is a diverse team, so they're all going back to different parts of the company, and if they're out there saying slightly different things, then that doesn't create a very robust outcome. It's not very resilient because people will hear different things and they'll say, well, these guys don't have their act together. What are they even doing? He said this, she said that. And even if you mean the same thing, if it's not super consistent, it may not be as coherent. And then the other reason that you want to kind of really think about crafting that narrative and what it is you're going to say is that if you don't have something prepared and rehearsed, then you might go to an emotional spot. And so someone says, how was it? Then it's oh, it was a lot of fun. Right. A lot of fun is my kryptonite. Yeah. I want people to have fun, but if that's what they're telling everyone in the organization, that's not going to lead to cultural change because the point is not to just come have a lot of fun. The point is to come do the best work we can together and to feel like we're doing everything we can to utilize everyone's strengths. And when we do that, everyone feels super empowered and actually worthwhile. It's important to feel that sense of self-worth.
Yeah, I think that empowerment, man, we did something awesome. It was hard work. We are tired as all get out. because we exerted a lot of mental, emotional, physical energy. But it's like, you look like you're a guy that works out. After you've had a good workout, you're really tired and spent, but it just feels good because you were really productive.
Right. And if you don't think about what it meant to be productive and what the real meaning is there that needs to be conveyed, then you're going to go to that emotional / physical space, and that's going to be your answer. So that's why we think it's really important to end your workshop with a really solid narrative building closer, or plan it like really quickly after. Maybe it's the following Monday or something, just to make sure everyone's aligned. We talk about what it is, and that way when you get stopped at the water cooler, you got it ready.
Right. All right, so that's share your story, and the third step is chart the course.
Yeah, once you've kind of wrapped it up and you're thinking about what you're telling people about what you did and what all that means, really thinking about next steps and getting really clear on, things like your governance structure, your metrics around how you're going to measure success and failure. Real big fan of user story mapping from Jeff Patton. That's a really great way to kind of map out like the roadmap, if you will, because roadmaps are kind of tricky business, especially with startups, right? It's like ultimately you just have a big backlog you're trying to chew on, and you don't really know when anything is going to be released. Like anyone who has like a 1-2-year roadmap with lots of fidelity is like kidding themselves, right? And so thinking about it from a user journey perspective, and what are the kind of I would say table stakes, or like what are the must-haves? It's like really like this combination of Moscow and user journey, right? Which is kind of how I think about user story mapping, right? Because it's like he's got this notion of like kind of prioritizing each step of the way, all the things that could be at that step, and then you kind of draw this line at your must-haves, right? So go build the journey out, but only build it as deep as you need to really kind of meet the user need or the user pain. And I think that can be a really fascinating way to think about taking some of this to life, because often the prototype you test in a design sprint will not have the entire journey identified. You've gotten to something that has value, something you can work on, but there's going to be kind of missing pieces that need to be fleshed out. And so really kind of mapping that stuff out is important.
Yeah. I love this next one because, as a company is possibly embracing a new approach to solving their complex problems for the first time, they've seen success in their first, whatever it was, a design sprint or some series of design thinking workshops. The next one is expand your inner circle. So I have an idea of what you mean by this, but share what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Well, design sprint is typically 7 people or so. And often after a design sprint, there are other people you need to consider. For instance, let's say that we had no idea that this project was going to require AI or ML, artificial intelligence or machine learning. And you, in the course of working through this work, you realize like, oh wow, there's a real opportunity for us to do some really special stuff here. Then we need to talk to the data science team and get them on board now, because there's some stuff that we don't fully understand, and they need to be part of this as stakeholders. Often you don't know what you're going to find before a design sprint, and so after the design sprint, you realize what it is you're building, and so you realize, wow, I need to involve these other people now. And maybe even ahead of time, you might know who these people might be. But certainly after the design sprint, it should be pretty clear that, wow, we need to get some other people involved. We need to build some advocacy around this work that we're doing. Another thing to consider too is often the design sprint will reveal if it's truly innovative, the solution that you discovered, it may not have a home in the organization. Mm-hmm. Based on our business units and the structure of how we break down departments and stuff, there may not be a VP or a director who this would neatly fall under. And so then we have to think about, well, who in the cross-cutting, matrixing, et cetera, whatever, is even remotely tied to this, and let's convene a conversation. So you just have to think about, like from a racy standpoint, who all you need to bring into the circle, because it's going to be more than the 7, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think also when you're able to, so one, you need to expand it to include other people that you didn't have in there before that you realize you now need. But I think another thing that I was thinking about in this particular area too is that as you start to share that story and tell people, hey, this is what we did, it was fantastic, it helped us achieve some pretty great outcomes. And then other people start to see, kind of like what you were saying about facilitation. When there's a facilitation practice within an organization, people start to see the light, if you will, and they start to embrace it. But it has to almost start at a very small level, and then from a grassroots perspective, grow organically versus someone saying at the top, this is how we're going to do things.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Anytime that there's a top-down initiative, like this is how we're going to do things, that I feel like it only works well if we take kind of a kata approach, where it's like, okay, this is where we want to go, but you guys figure out how to do it, and then the team organically increments their way there. That can work, which is great because leadership's setting a direction, so everyone feels unified, understands their mission, their purpose. But then they're given the autonomy to kind of like just evolve their way there. That can be powerful. Also, I guess this is a nice segue to cultivate the culture, which is another section, and because what you're describing is exactly what I discussed in that chapter, which is this work. To be truly transformative to organizations means that we need to change the way we think about the way we work together and how we meet and, frankly, how we get work done. And in fact, I like to bring these kind of mindsets and these ways of working into everyday meetings. And one of our favorites is no prototype, no meeting, which our mantra is do the work in the meeting. Like if we just have a meeting to meet, like I don't know if it's even worth the time, right? And people talk about, it's funny when people talk about we don't have time for a 5-day design sprint, and it's like I'm always really curious. Like I'd love to see your calendar and think about like how that time is being invested. And you should think about it as an investment. In fact, I love the calendar plugins that calculate the cost of a meeting. And that shows you the price of the meeting before you can, it's a little extra like confirmation box where you have to see that and decide if you're going to do it. And really fascinated by the stuff that Zappos is doing, where they're evolving away from holacracy into this kind of, they're calling it market-driven dynamics. And basically it's like each team has a P&L and they have to create a list of services, and they'll negotiate rates with other parts of the organization. And so if you want me to work on something with you, then that's going to come out of your budget. And so you really think about how you consume resources within the company, so that this meeting calendar pricing like pop-up is kind of similar in that regard, right? Like let's get really conscious about how we're investing our time in these gatherings and make them as powerful as possible. And it's not that we're talking about going beyond just like, oh, do we have an agenda and do people show up on time? It's like, no, let's think about how we craft the agenda in a way that unleashes everyone.
Right. And I think one thing to really, for people to understand too about a concentrated, say a design sprint of 4 or 5 days, not every single person is going to be literally dedicating 8 hours per day every day. But I think what you can achieve in 1 week, some people have said you can achieve what might normally take on a calendar 3 to 6 months because of just how long it takes for projects to get rolling. And I think that's the value that many people don't understand is, yes, you may have to dedicate 5 days in a given week for 7 people. Okay, that's where they do the math. But where they don't do the math is you're actually shortening a product, cycle time of 3 to 6 months down to that 1 week. How have you explained that to people in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job just now. I mean, we've got a little ROI deck that kind of explains some of these things, and I've had this really model to show it to you. It's a little postcard we made, and essentially it shows you what happens when you build software based on hunches and assumptions, and then get it wrong, and then have to iterate. And we call that the MVP model. So if you take the MVP model and you build something and you test it and then you tweak it and iterate, it's a lot better than going waterfall and like taking a year to go build the best thing you could imagine and then realizing it's all wrong. But even better is if you create a simulation of it and test that. And the best way for medium to large giant companies to get to these point where they can build prototypes is by bringing the people together to make the rapid decisions. And so this is kind of like explaining those scenarios and the cost trade-offs. And, you're right. A lot of people are looking at the direct labor costs when they should be looking at opportunity costs. Right. What can they gain? What is the upside for this investment? Again, coming back to that investment, because at the end of the day, they're still making a lot of investments in meetings, like in the time that people are spending just day to day, and how well is that investment paying off versus what the upside of this other approach could be. I think that's how people should think about it.
So the very last step is get guidance. What's that all about?
Yeah, I've always been a huge believer and proponent of mentorship, and listen to the people who have done it before. Jake blazed an amazing path. There's a lot of great stuff in the book. There's certainly a lot of forums and great content out there. We've got a blog where we're constantly providing tips and new ways of thinking about stuff.
It's an awesome blog. I absolutely love it. There's some really practical tips on that blog. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And certainly, like you could get a coach, you could find someone within your organization that's maybe done some facilitation before. There's mentors out there that might be able just to help you out. Plenty of people like to pay it forward, if you will. And then of course there's lots of coaches like Daniel and I, Daniel Stillman, who's going to be running the master classes with me this week and speaking at the conference. And then of course, I'm a big believer in external facilitators. That's why I started my agency. And so, if there's budget, highly recommend bringing in an external facilitator, because your team can focus on the hard work of creating the solutions and driving outcomes. And you can have someone that's external focused on the process, the methodology, keeping the time allocated, and everyone paying attention to all the nuance to make sure everyone's has space and whatnot. And I think that stuff's very critical. And that is a way to have even more momentum, potentially even avoid the slump entirely, because you kind of invested in this stuff up front. And, people with experience around this stuff also can help you set some of these upfront expectations that also help you kind of not kind of veer into the pit, if you will.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic stuff. I hope that people can reach out to you. We've been talking to Douglas Ferguson, the president of Voltage Control and the author of the book Beyond the Prototype. So Douglas, if people want to learn more about you, where can they go?
Just come to voltagecontrol.com. Lots of stuff there, writings and resources you can download, and also the books at beyondtheprototype.com.
All right, Douglas, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Culture Design Show. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review of the podcast.